Good morning. My name is Brendan McInerny. I'm a Catholic theologian and teacher working in the Western suburbs. I'm extremely grateful to be speaking to you today. I'm hoping my talk today can give something of an introduction to the theology of play in a way that is both thought-provoking and accessible. The subject has been a passion project of mine for a number of years now, in large measure due to my work in college and high school classrooms. Again and again, I am struck by how work-driven young people are. Ask college students why they are in college, and they invariably answer to get a good job. Ask ninth graders to name someone they admire, and they typically say their mother or father or another relative because they work hard. Not because they are loving, not because they're good at math, but because they work hard. And if they don't say mom or dad, they name someone known for their wealth, like Elon Musk. Data backs up my firsthand impressions. In a 2019 Pew survey on the long-term goals of teenagers, 95% of teens say that having a job or career they enjoy is extremely or very important to them. An enjoyable career beats out the rest of the field, including helping people, that's only 81%, marriage, 47%, having children, 39%, and fame, only 11%. I'm partially relieved that having a lot of money is a long-term goal of only 51% of teenagers, but distressed that the average hides a 20-point difference between boys and girls. 61% of teenage boys think that having a lot of money would be extremely or very important to them personally as an adult, while only 41% of girls share this same priority. The same survey also found that 88% of teenagers felt a lot or some pressure to get good grades. Only 12% felt not too much or not at all. And 78% identified anxiety and depression as a major problem among people their age. Data like this remains only a snapshot, determined by a number of factors, each of which shapes the responses given. Change, say, the phrasing of the question or the answer options, and the numbers might come out differently. And of course, the snapshot tells us little about just what a teenager imagines an enjoyable career might be, or the difference between some and not too much pressure. Nevertheless, I think the snapshot suggests that there is a correlation between mental health, the pressure to succeed in school, and the importance placed on an enjoyable career. The pressure to find a fulfilling job ratchets up the pressure to get good grades in high school, which in turn ratchets up anxiety and depression. We find our kids are in the early stages of what Derek Thompson, writing in The Atlantic, calls workism, the belief that work is not only necessary to economic production, but also the centerpiece of one's identity and life's purpose, and, we might add, worth. How are Christians supposed to respond to this crisis? It is clear that as Christians, we have a lot to say about work. We often speak of a work ethic, of the good of personal responsibility, reliability, diligence, and alacrity, that joyful willingness to do what must be done. On a deeper personal level, some of us also sense that our careers are more than a paycheck, but maybe even a vocation given to us by God. In the Catholic tradition, at least, we often talk about the dignity of work itself and the way in which work is a sacred obligation given to all of us by God for our good. Indeed, Pope John Paul II claimed that it is through work that we achieve fulfillment, his words, achieve fulfillment as human beings. But I hope it is at least instinctively clear that the mania about work, the damage that it's causing that we see among our children and maybe even ourselves, does not match the gospel. While it is good to admire someone's work ethic or pursue fulfilling work, our sense of identity should not rest exclusively on our job, even if we call it our vocation. No job, however meaningful, can carry that burden, and many of us will have multiple jobs throughout our lives, many of which may be jobs of necessity. And all of us will go through periods in our lives in which we won't be able to work at all. So while it is true, very true, that God created us to work, it is also true that God created us for more than work. I hope to show you today that we have forgotten that we were made for play too. And it is actually in play that we most clearly reflect the image of our Maker. going to set up some slides here for you. These are really just to kind of help you think about what I'm talking about. They're not at all to distract you from what I'm saying. I'm not going to comment too much on them. They'll just kind of accompany my words, hopefully successfully. They give you something to think about. Anyway, we've brought up this topic of play, and you might now be thinking of play, playing fetch with your dog, your children, playing make-believe, maybe even playing sports. But when I talk about play, I mean something much grander than all of that. In fact, for our purposes today, it may be better to think of play as less of a discrete activity, like a game or a contest or something, and more of a characteristic or an element within many kinds of activities, some of which we would commonly call play and others not. As Johann Huizinga, one of the great play theorists of the last century, put it, in play we may move below the level of seriousness as a child does, but we can also move above it, in the realm of the beautiful and the sacred. Play can exist at the smallest, most humble level of life, as well as in realms of grandeur. The special meal you've prepared for a beloved guest entails play, but so too does the great civic festival or religious holiday. Children play with wild abandon at recess, and the ballerina plays with prescribed abandon in her dance. To sit down with a novel on a lazy afternoon is surely play, and you also play when you bow your head in silent prayer to the living God. Play, or its traces, can also describe certain objects. What we typically call art is almost always a product or physical example of play. Just as a musician plays music, plays with sounds to create something beautiful to hear, so too we might say that a painter plays at color, form, line, etc. Art, as art, always entails something extra utile, something beyond usefulness, which puts it in the category of play. There we go. Isn't that beautiful? Despite the variety of its occurrences, play is recognized according to four main characteristics. Now, these characteristics appear, I think, in virtually all forms of play. Sometimes we'll find them in greater or lesser intensity depending on the specific instance. First, it is free or non-utilitarian. Second, it is extraordinary. Third, it possesses a frame, it possesses boundaries, limits. And finally, play tends to create community. So first, and by far in a way the most important, play implies freedom. It is never necessary. As Huizinga explains, the need for play is only urgent to the extent that the enjoyment of it makes a need. Play can be deferred or suspended at any time. It is never imposed by physical necessity or moral duty. It is never a task. It is done in leisure, during free time. Only when play is a recognized cultural function, a rite, a ceremony, is it bound up with obligation and duty. That final sentence, that play can be bound up with obligation when it is something like a religious ritual, will help us understand the nature of certain laws establishes in the Old Testament regarding the cessation of work, and we will get to those later. But despite circumstances involving divine or social obligations to play, we can still say that play can never be forced upon someone from the outside. The action, the rite, or ceremony may carry the weight of a divine commandment, but the player, the actor, must always choose to fulfill the solemn obligation or not. Being forced to play in order to avoid punishment, for instance, is a contradiction in terms, because insofar as the person playing is only acting to avoid punishment, it's not play at all, it's work. And just as it cannot be forced by external pressure, play too is also purposeless. It is unnecessary by virtue of being purposeless, in the sense that it does not serve as a means to some external end. That is, play is not subordinate to some superior aim, which alone would give it its worth. Now, it might be that this phrasing is out of sync with our typical habits of speech. We want typically to think that we play with purpose. But another way to say it is that whenever that whatever purpose play has, it is fulfilled in or even identical to the act of playing itself. What do I mean? Take the example of contest games. Here we could say that there seems to be a clear purpose, winning. However, in those games that include winning, and not all games do, not all play does, the purpose of winning is not really distinguishable from playing the game. In such games, we play to win. Or to use another example, that beautiful work of art you've put above your desk does not really serve any purpose. It is not there to teach you something or to help you accomplish some other task. Instead, it is there because it is beautiful. And being beautiful, it gives you some pleasure, some joy. On its broadest level, then, the only real purpose we could attribute to play is, as the Huizinga quotation suggested, the enjoyment it causes in us. We play because it brings joy. Or perhaps we ought to reverse that. We are joyful because we play. Second, as free and without purpose, play is extraordinary. It interrupts the usual demands and activities that seem to drive our daily lives. Most of what we do throughout the day is probably not marked by any clear play element. We only do most of what we do as means to some further ends. We wake, clean ourselves up, dress, and eat a hasty breakfast so that we are suitably ready for work, which is in turn most likely filled with a lot of tasks you must do in order to complete your job, in order to do it well and do it right. Play puts this typical order of means and ends on hold. We cease doing work or other necessary tasks and instead engage in something for its own sake. For its own sake. We do it because it brings us pleasure and for no other further reason. Therefore, play is often described as superfluous and extravagant, or my favorite word, gratuitous. It's like the image that we've had up for a little while here. It's a superfluous beauty, a superfluous joy added on to the normal. As extraordinary, play is closely linked with leisure. Leisure seems to be a precondition for any genuine play. You need time away from work in order to play. And play is also, therefore, closely linked with festivity, maybe the most intense form or confluence of forms of play. Despite the manner in which play overturns and interrupts the ordinary, play's third major characteristic is that it is nevertheless ordered and orderly in two respects. First, play occurs within particular boundaries or limits. These boundaries might be in space, as in the field, pitch, ground, board, or the frame of a work of art. The boundaries might also be in time, demarcating the beginning and end of play, the start of the festival, the conclusion of a match. Baseball has its opening pitch, football its kickoff, the curtain rises in a stage production. And with the final out, the end buzzer, and the final scene concludes. Play has ended. In addition to boundaries demarcating play from not play, play also lives by its own internal order or rules. These rules are most obvious in the case of formal written rules, like what you might have with a board game or a sport or the score of a piece of music or maybe a script for a drama. But sometimes play only has informal rules. The work of an improv comedy team has rules, even if they're not written down. Children's play is often filled with very informal, but sometimes also very strict rules. And my 4-year-old will tell you when you violate them. Or consider jazz improvisation. Basic melody and chord progression provides only the barest hint of the rules of play. Instead, the rules and order develop extemporaneously in the musical interactions of the musicians themselves. Importantly, the rules of play are not subject to any kind of external explanation. Even if they change, rules are not established with any kind of absolute rationale. Put otherwise, the order of play is not one of external necessity. The order shares in that purposelessness of the play as a whole. I cannot explain to you why there must be an infield fly rule in order for baseball to happen. Any explanation could only appeal to the fittingness of the rule to allow better play, but that's the extent of it. Everything is determined by the play itself. Once again, this is a function of the freedom of play. The rules need not be exactly so, except by the free acceptance of the players. And it is so in reference to itself and not some outside measure. Fourth, and finally, play creates community. The evidence for this community creation is readily available to anyone who has spent any time in organized sports, drama, or music programs. It is almost impossible to imagine a scenario in which playing in such a manner could be done without forming bonds of friendship. And particularly in the case of sports, even the audience can be bound together as a community of fans. Why? This is not entirely clear. Perhaps it is simple as perhaps it is as simple as the sharing of a common goal or task for a time. But I'm inclined to think that it goes deeper than that. For surely it is in the workplace that we more accurately share a common goal with our peers than in play, which is sometimes deliberately antagonistic, so much so that it can even cause violence. But workplaces only occasionally deserve the label communities. I think play can create such powerful bonds precisely because it is free, purposeless, or wasteful. In pure work, our identities are eclipsed by the tasks we are supposed to perform, and therefore, we are replaceable if we fail to do the job. I will return to this below, but I think the awareness of serving as a means to an end, and with that fear of being replaced, is a major cause of our collective anxieties. In play, however, even in those types which demand that specific players perform very specific tasks, a stage production for instance, because the play itself is not a means to an end, none of the players are either. There is real vulnerability in this mutual acceptance among these players, for it carries the risk of rejection as well. That recess time fear of no one wanting to play with me is very real. But once play has begun, the team, the crew, the cast, it is set. It is this group of people and this group of people alone that will be with you as you set out into the extraordinary world of the game, of the play. Huizinga gives us some clue about the dynamics at work. He says, the feeling of being apart together in an exceptional situation, of sharing something important, of mutually withdrawing from the rest of the world and rejecting its usual norms, retains its magic beyond the duration of the original game. It is not simply the free association of players that create community, but some deep magic in the play itself. I think this magic is the manner in which the rules of play make play its own kind of world. Play has the makings of a fairy tale, in which everything hangs upon strict and strange rules. I know of no one who recognized this character of fairy tales better than G.K. Chesterton. He writes, "The true citizen of fairyland is obeying something that he does not understand at all. In the fairy tale, an incomprehensible happiness rests upon an incomprehensible condition. A box is opened, and all evils fly out. A word is forgotten, and cities perish. A lamp is lit, and love flies away. A flower is plucked, and human lives are forfeited. An apple is eaten, and the hope of God is gone." The stakes of our playing are typically less dire than the stakes of a fairy tale. But here too, play's order comes from beyond the players themselves. A game is forfeited when certain conditions are not met. Maybe you don't have enough players. A penalty is incurred when rules are violated. In play, we enter a world beyond our control and adopt its terms. When we play with others, we share in an adventure. I'm convinced that a moment's thought will show that play is I'm convinced that a moment's thought will show that play is a nearly irrepressible element in human life, pervading the world in which we live. If classical philosophy named us the language animal or the rational animal, it would be equally true to name us the playing animal. Play seems to be part of our human nature. When we speak we almost invariably play. We play with words, we play with metaphor, we play with meaning, we speak in irony. All of that is play. Furthermore, I would hazard to guess that play is incredibly important to you personally. Whether it is hitting the links on the weekend, getting engrossed in a piece of music, leisurely enjoying a book, literally playing with your kids, or maybe simply wasting your scarce free time with your loved ones. However you might choose to play, it seems that these kinds of things, these acts of playing, are where we experience some of our deepest joys and satisfaction. These are the kinds of things we look forward to in the planning and enjoy in the remembering. It is not our work, whether in terms of our jobs or in terms of the tasks we simply have to do to get through the day, that defines us. It is our play. And yet, if play really does cause our deepest joys, how did we end up in a society in which our children and ourselves obsess about finding a dream job? Why would we imagine that our identity and happiness depend on our work? It is tempting to suppose that the real motive here is to find a job that will pay well enough to afford more leisure time. Certainly that's what I imagine when I think of a dream job. Distressingly, however, the article on workism I mentioned earlier shows that contrary to all, and I mean all, historical patterns, the wealthiest in our society are actually putting more and more time into their work life. In particular, the top of the socioeconomic ladder, highly educated, wealthy white men, now beat their poorer male peers in the US and their comparably wealthy peers in other nations in hours worked per week. And while white males lead this trend, it is also occurring across every demographic group at the top of the income. Aristotle once claimed that work was for the sake of leisure, but now what was once known as the leisure class has decided to work for the sake of more work. Though I think workism, that particular linking of personal identity, happiness, and worth with one's career, suitably describes what's happening among the economically privileged, it does not adequately explain why those most able to pursue leisure and play do not. I think there's a deeper problem, one that extends beyond the habits of the wealthy and into a total frame of reference shaping not only how we live, but also how we reason and how we determine worth. We live in a paradigm that celebrates purpose and work, means over ends, measurable progress and control over purposelessness, ends themselves, and the unknown and uncontrollable. This frame of reference has been given a number of names. It is the world of total work, utilitarianism, or sometimes late capitalism. But I think the most accurate name, one favored by Pope Francis, is the technocratic paradigm. The technocratic paradigm, or technocracy, refers to a rule of technology and technique. These terms share a root in the Greek techne, a knowledge of doing or making, associated with craft and work, rather than pure disinterested understanding. Techne in Greek is know-how. Importantly, we should not assume that technology refers exclusively to high-tech products or even physical tools. Technology can refer to any object of human artifice, anything that we have made that we use to augment our power over the world and direct the world to our designated ends. In this respect, the technology of technocracy may correctly describe social structures just as well as computers. As a paradigm, to speak of technocracy is to speak of a set of prejudices for determining human thought and action according to the logic of technology. Put otherwise, the technocratic paradigm imagines the world and things within it as complex machines directed to designated ends. This applies to inanimate things, natural resources, living creatures, including human beings, as well as the fabric of social life. Everything is a machine, everything is a tool, everything can be manipulated. It's difficult to determine exactly when the technocratic paradigm achieved its current ascendant position. Certainly, it did not fall from the sky complete. It came in fits and starts, slowly replacing whatever we would call what came before it. It is arguable, I think, to put its roots as far back as the European Age of Discovery and early Enlightenment. However, with greater exactitude, it is fair to say that the paradigm truly comes into its own in the mid-19th century. It is in the 1840s and 1850s that the new possibilities of technology unleashed in the Industrial Revolution, celebrated and advertised in many, many industrial exhibitions, began shaping the Western cultural imagination. Steel and glass allowed human construction to take new and extraordinary forms. The steam engine broke the monopoly of muscle, wind, and current in human locomotion and the production of goods. Through the machine, human power over nature seemed potentially limitless. The success of such technology even encouraged a reshaping of human language. We became accustomed to speaking and seeing things according to the model and standard of machines. As early as the 17th century, the world itself was described as a clock. In the 19th and early 20th centuries, as you can see in the image, the idea of the factory arose as a particularly powerful image of human life and the human body. Today, we easily draw on computer and digital terminology to talk about our life. We speak of being hardwired, for instance, or perhaps we look for life hacks to make daily tasks easier. It might be that we are inclined to think that these are mere metaphors, but they nevertheless indicate and shape our imagination about the world, and therefore the possibilities of human action therein. Seeing the world as a vast reservoir of resources to seize, or other human beings as nothing more than living tools, form the imagination of conquerors and slaveholders. In more recent memory, totalitarian states attempted to make all aspects of social life serve the purposes of the revolution, the party, or the leader, to the destruction of any who opposed or who were deemed unfit. And today, it is easy to find tech entrepreneurs, philosophers, and futurists asserting that reality literally is a computer simulation, or hoping to transfer the data of our minds into servers and thus achieve a kind of immortality. With the model of a machine in mind, the technocratic paradigm exalts the standard of purposefulness above all others. And I mean this as a precise term. That which we call purpose is, in the true sense of the word, and I'm quoting Romano Guardini here, the distributive, organizing principle which subordinates actions or objects to other actions or objects, so that the one is directed towards the other, and the one exists for the sake of the other. That which is subordinate, the means, is only significant insofar as it is capable of serving that which is superior, the end. The purpose does not infuse a spiritual value into its medium. It uses it as a passage for something else, a thoroughfare merely. Aim and fulcrum alike reside in the former. From this point of view, every instrument has to prove in the first place whether, and in the second, to what extent it is fitted to accomplish the purpose for which it is employed. It's a long quotation, but it's a good one. To put it otherwise, purpose is the measure of a tool. And if the world is a machine, a factory, a computer, the world and everything in it, itself a vast tool, it's all just a complex of means to some ends. Now, crucially for technocracy, we human beings, or more accurately, some human beings, are supposed to master the machine of the world through knowledge. Francis Bacon's axiom, knowledge is power, is the technocrat's creed. And it is not a coincidence that in the midst of the technological boom of the mid-19th century, the great thinker Karl Marx would assert that the purpose of philosophy is not to interpret the world, but to change it, to use knowledge to alter its conditions. Knowledge makes possible a more subtle and more efficient application of power. A hallmark feature of the technocratic paradigm is therefore an obsession, and we see this all over the place, an obsession with data, systems, explanations. The more information available, the more likely we can direct the world to our desired ends. Social media is an excellent example of this dynamic. Platforms like Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube track our browsing habits, especially when we follow links in the platforms, so that they can get a more and more refined data to match you with paying advertisers. If you've ever had the sense that your smartphone or computer overheard you because right after you were done talking about something, you immediately saw an ad for it on your phone or laptop or something, you know how eerie this personally tailored advertising can be. Or, to put it more accurately, advertising that has the appearance of being personally tailored. Social media companies don't care about anything about you that can't be sold to specific advertisers. Your personal uniqueness is totally unusable because your uniqueness is incalculable. The information they have about your habits must be of the same kind as the information garnered from others on the platform, on the website, so it can be all parsed and bundled together for the paying client. They want you or the information about you to be uniform. It has to be broken down into usable parts. The parts must be interchangeable, or as interchangeable as possible. Therefore, the focus on parts is really a focus on uniformity, on the average, on standardization. The products that fill our homes, the food that we usually eat, the planning of our cities, even the design of our workspaces, all of these are dictated by industrial standardization. This makes possible more exact planning, order, and efficiency. And with this better planning and organization, technocracy implies progress. Not simply a matter of technological development, like things getting better, but progress in technocracy is a self-conscious program and assumption. The development of more efficient technologies is always being sought, and it is presumed to be continuous. It is not enough to build a machine that works, that gets the job done. The machine can always theoretically be made more efficient or be replaced by a more efficient version of the machine. The technocratic paradigm cannot abide a final version of a tool. Think of the familiarity of rolling out of new smartphones. We buy one of the most important tools we possess with the absolute certain knowledge that within a year or two, maybe less, a newer, better phone will come on the market. Some of us are addicted to having the newest phone, so you know what I'm talking about. In a world so thoroughly shaped by purpose, planning, and progressive efficiency, is it any wonder that the wealthiest among us would succumb to workism? The technocratic paradigm offers virtually no way of justifying genuine leisure or play. It is true, of course, that we often interrupt work with allotted breaks during the day, weekends, national holidays, paid time off. However, such breaks are not necessarily playtime. We are allowed our breaks so that we can recuperate and work harder after our break or rest. But we do not play so that something else can happen. This difference might not always be obvious, but we can say that the internal logic of work breaks is one of measured, finite resources, specifically the resources of our physical and mental energy. Our bodies get sore, our brains get fried, we need lunch, the weekend, or a vacation to recuperate. However, because of the success of technocratic progress, these necessary breaks are also a threat. For the time being, your job may be secure, but there is no guarantee that it can't be outsourced, automated, or just plain given to someone else who works that much harder in the future. By equating work with identity, self-worth, and fulfillment, workism fully embraces the logic of technocracy and provides a motive for the privileged to keep on working in the face of greater and greater competition. But workism is a luxury. It is a luxury for those able to win in technocracy. At the other end of the income ladder, workers languish in underemployment or obscurity, doing unfulfilling, meaningless jobs that have not yet been given over to machines. It's hard to imagine a meat packer, a cashier, or a gig worker confusing their job with their deeper identity or a lasting source of joy in their life. even when we celebrate them or supposedly celebrate them as essential workers. Christians can challenge the evils of technocracy in a number of ways. In particular, there is a pressing need to ensure some level of support and care for the men and women who have been deemed useless. I'm thinking not only in terms of economic policies and supporting political policies that will prevent a race to the bottom for low-income workers, but also the simple care of those like the elderly who are so often set aside and forgotten because they are no longer economically productive. During the pandemic, we even witnessed politicians express a willingness to risk the lives of the elderly in order to keep the system running. We have to fight that. But Christians have to go deeper too. We cannot simply work to mitigate the worst effects of technocracy. As always, we must proclaim the gospel by our lives. And in this matter, the truth of the gospel is diametrically opposed to technocracy and its worship of work. At the very outset of Scripture, we find the great creation myth in which God fashions the universe over the course of 6 days. Each day commences with a creative declaration of God that brings order to what had once been chaos and draws a new, distinct being into existence. For instance, God says, "Let there be light," and the light is separated from darkness. A number of features of this myth are worth pointing out. The acts of creation progress to a climax in the creation of humankind on the 6th day. This climax is clear not only because humankind occurs at the very end of the list, but also because the language used to narrate this creative act does not fit the established pattern. God has much more to say about the creation of humankind than about any other creatures. And what he says reveals the deep bond between God and human beings. "Let us make a human in our image by our likeness," God says, according to a recent translation by Robert Alter. And this human will hold sway and conquer the earth and its creatures. The status of human beings in this tale, their being granted what is typically called dominion, has come under criticism for encouraging rampant exploitation of the world. And true enough, holding sway and conquering the earth and its creatures, mimicking a God whose divinity is exercised in the myth, in the work of creating, do seem to match the ideals of technocracy. However, reading this way neglects two important details that place human dominion into context. First, while the text does present God's action as a kind of work or labor, it is a labor or work that is effortless. In sharp contrast to the creation myths of neighboring cultures, the scriptural text reveals a God who creates in purest freedom without any conflict or strain. Similarly, though it is only implied, it is also the case that God himself does not need to create in order to realize some hidden ulterior motive. In the scriptural reckoning of things, creation is not a tool or technology for God, a means to some end imposed upon him. And I'll use a male pronoun here for God, simply for consistency with the scriptural text itself. Obviously, God is not a he. While the psalmist sings that the heavens declare the glory of God, and we often say that God creates for the sake of his glory, what these statements mean is that the act of creation is an effortless and gratuitous revelation of God's sovereign freedom. The creation of the universe reveals that God is free to create the universe. Creation, therefore, declares God's glory precisely by being good for nothing with respect to God. That phrase, good for nothing, is from the former Archbishop of Canterbury, Rowan Williams. Creation adds nothing to God's own essential blessedness, his own essential perfection. The famous vision of creation from the showings of Julian of Norwich captures something of this gratuitous and almost fragile nature of creation. She writes, God showed me something small, no bigger than a hazelnut, lying in the palm of my hand. And I perceived that it was as round as any ball. I looked at it and thought, what can this be? And I was given this general answer: it is everything which is made. I was amazed that it could last, for I thought that it was so little that it could suddenly fall into nothing. The smallness of everything that is made, no bigger than a hazelnut. In fact, far, far smaller than that, because there is no true comparison between the infinite God and the finite creation. The smallness raises the crucial question. If creation is good for nothing, nothing more than an insignificant hazelnut, which by itself could just as well fall back into nothingness, why does God create at all? As we read in English, creation, as Scripture tells us, is good, very good. But what kind of goodness could it have if it is good for nothing from God's point of view? The ancient Greek translation of the passage uses the word kalon, where we read good. And this is our clue. Kalon does not mean good for a purpose. It means the goodness of excellence, aesthetic goodness, or what we would probably prefer to call beauty. God sees what he has made and sees that it is beautiful, a delight simply by being what it is. God creates because, and only because, it brings him delight to do so. I don't have another way of saying this, but put simply, creation is the playing of God. And we find this articulated in the book of Proverbs. Divine wisdom, the very personification of God's creative power, declares herself, I was his delight day after day, playing before him at all times, playing in the world, his earth, and my delight was with humankind. Intriguingly, this idea that God somehow plays is not exclusive to the Judeo-Christian tradition. One finds, for instance, the beloved legends in the Bhagavata Purana of the child god Krishna in Leela. Leela means something like pure play or spontaneous pastime, encompassing sport, dance, song, and other acts besides. Krishna is always at Leela. In one particular legend, the child Krishna is playing in the mud. Like many other children, much to their parents' chagrin, he puts the mud in his mouth. At once his adopted mother, Yashoda, not knowing that Krishna is an incarnation of God, grabs him and demands to look in his mouth to get the mud out. As the legend tells us, Lord Hari Krishna, whose supremacy cannot be constrained, but who is God assuming the form of a human boy for play, opened wide. Yashoda saw there the universe of moving and unmoving things, space, the cardinal directions, the sphere of the earth with its oceans, islands, and mountains, air and fire, the moon and the stars. She saw the circles of the constellations, water, light, the wind, the sky. She sees in the mouth of the child Krishna at play the entirety of the universe. And according to the myth, when Yashoda beholds this universe in the mouth of her adopted son, she finally recognizes his divinity and falls down in adoration. But Krishna, wishing to return to his play, allows the illusion of his non-divinity, the illusion that is his humanity, to fall over her again. She forgets what she sees and once again imagines she is his mother and he is just a kid playing in the dirt. In ancient Greek thought, too, play is used in association with the gods and their relationship to creatures. Near the outset of his laws, Plato makes the bold claim that we are the playthings of the gods, and later, that is the best thing about us. Now, if being called a plaything is upsetting, it is likely because we fear being manipulated or cast aside. But for a Christian, we really need not worry about that. Because the mystery of the Trinity has been revealed to us, we can be confident that the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit do not make sport of us for some dark entertainment. God, as revealed in the Trinity, is joyous love in himself. And therefore, his creation of the universe is always determined by the joyous love that he is. The entirety of everything that is created may be nothing more than a hazelnut compared to the grandeur of the infinite God. But as Julian was told in her vision, it lasts and always will because God loves it. And thus everything has being through and only through the love of God. Creation is truly good for nothing with respect to God's self. But therefore, we must say this, that God creates for the good of creatures themselves. Put differently, if God creates only because he delights to do so, we must say that his only delight in creating is to give his joy to his creatures. The game God is playing with his creatures is a game of selfless love, of delight in the good of the other. Returning again then to the Genesis myth, all of what we have just said must drastically qualify the idea of human dominion as present in the narrative. Presumably, the derivative lordship, the derivative dominion of the human being within creation takes God's own lordship above creation as its model. And if God's lordship is not in the order of domination or exploitation, creation is good for nothing as far as God is concerned, but rather in the order of delight and love, then our lordship should be as well. We are to be lords within creation by delighting in and loving our fellow creatures as God delights in and loves the entirety of what he has made. Fortunately, the Genesis myth itself gives some practical direction as to how we might begin to do this. I said earlier that the creation of human beings in God's image and likeness, blessed with dominion over the earth, was the climactic act of creation, occurring at the end of the sixth day. However, as we all likely recall, the story does not end there, but continues to the seventh day, the Sabbath. Though God completed creating everything in the 6 days, it is only on the Sabbath, on the seventh day, that God completed the task he had done. The work of creation is completed in Sabbath rest. And for this reason, the Sabbath, and the Sabbath alone of all the days of creation, indeed, at this moment in Scripture, alone of any and all things, is declared holy. As far as the first creation story of Genesis is concerned, there is no eighth day, no resumption of creative work on the next day. God is done. He has fulfilled all the goals of his creation with the commencement of Sabbath rest. There is nothing for him to do. It's over. We need to keep that in mind because it helps us better understand God's command to the Israelites in Exodus to keep the Sabbath holy, to keep the seventh day holy. The strict Sabbath injunction against work of any kind, for you, your children, your slaves, your guests, even your livestock, is not for the sake of recharging your batteries in order to get back to work the next day. Unlike work breaks and purely technocratic thinking, the Sabbath is not for the sake of the weekdays. The weekdays are for the sake of the Sabbath. It is not an interlude, but the climax of living, in the words of the great Abraham Joshua Heschel. More than mere halting of work for the sake of work, the Sabbath entails an active abstention from using the things of creation for our own benefit. We set the day apart from the other 6, refusing to put it to our uses. On the Sabbath day, this only occurs on a small scale, but we can find the refusal of utilitarianism scaled up in other Old Testament institutions. Beyond the weekly cycle culminating in the Sabbath, the year was structured by major festivals set apart from the usual work time each with their own specific rituals and demands. In the household, Israelites were commanded to offer their slaves freedom after 6 years of service. We'll speak about this more in my next talk, but once they arrived in Canaan, the Israelites were to give their land itself a Sabbath, letting their fields go fallow, eating only what the land produces of its own, as well as canceling all debts. And finally, after 7 cycles of 7 years, the Israelites were to declare the Jubilee, in which the land would have its Sabbath, and in the sabbatical, at this Jubilee, property would revert to the original owners or their descendants, and debts would be forgiven, slaves released. And day in and day out, the Israelite priests offered sacrifices to God, setting a portion of livestock or crop outside of typical utilitarian usage in the most dramatic form possible, burning it upon the altar. And they did so at a location set apart from all others. First in the tabernacle as they wandered the wilderness, and then in the temple in Jerusalem. All of these ancient ritual institutions bear the mark of play, of a kind that bears the weight of a divine obligation. It was a kind of play far more serious than that of our usual games and leisure. It is tempting to suppose that Christians have left all of that stuff behind us. But I think it is important here to recall Christ's own words, that he did not come to abolish the law, but to fulfill it. Fulfilled, it has been transformed for us, but it has not been lost. We no longer offer animal sacrifice or need to fret about making sure we have not violated Sabbath rest. But we are heirs of the same non-utilitarian, anti-technocratic spirit of sacrifice and the Sabbath that we find in the Old Testament. We are heirs of the same spirit of play. We should breathe this spirit of play in our Sunday liturgical worship, for it is the memorial of Christ's resurrection, the beginning of the true Sabbath of creation. I can only speak now as one formed by the Catholic tradition and its liturgical practices, but I am certain that they can suitably apply to your own modes of worship. The liturgy is play. It is play, or at least entails a lot of playfulness. This is the argument of the great 20th century theologian Romano Guardini in his seminal work, The Spirit of the Liturgy. Guardini's point is quite simple. The liturgy, our worship, is not a means adapted to some external end. Its aim of glorifying God and sanctifying men and women is accomplished precisely in its doing. Even the moral or didactic elements of the liturgy, though they are important, these are subordinate for Guardini to the liturgy's more essential playfulness. We do not gather on Sunday exclusively to teach or to be taught. For if that was the whole of it, we could find far better avenues. No, the liturgy is best understood according to the claims of its major texts, or at least the major texts in my own tradition. We praise, we bless, we adore God, we give him thanks for his glory. We gather, speak, sing, gesture, offer sacrifice of thanksgiving in order to gather, speak, sing, gesture, and offer sacrifice of thanksgiving. If the technocratic paradigm is constantly deferring our true ends, holding them out like a carrot, that perfect job, that raise, that who knows what, or even pushing them entirely out of our view to keep us moving forward, the liturgy frustrates by collapsing means and ends into each other, just like any other form of play. Even those elements that are even those elements we are most inclined to think of as didactic, say the reading from Scripture or the sermon, certainly the reading of Scripture. In my own tradition, we surround that event with singing, ritual movement, and gestures, and the offering of yet more glory to God. Evidently, according to the ritual's logic and text, the reading is not primarily for our benefit, so that we might recount but rather so that we might recount to God what God himself has done. Our means of glorifying God being entirely provided by what God has already done for us. Looked at from this point of view, liturgy is frivolous. It is at best a decoration or an ornament of life. It interrupts the flow of ordinary life with its extraordinary character. And that is precisely the point. We cannot identify any clear use for the liturgy for our worship because in it we reach an end, an eschatological landing site in the middle of time, in which the questions of use and purpose are completely set aside. Abraham Heschel, mentioned earlier, says that on the Sabbath, we are called upon to share in what is eternal in time. We are called upon to share in what is eternal in time. It is the same for our Christian Sunday liturgies. There, we are encompassed by the kingdom, sharing in the peace and joy of God's game of grace. I hope my assertion at the outset of the talk that we were made for play because God himself plays has been made sufficiently clear. The play for which we have truly been made is the play of the Sabbath, the play of worship, the play of the kingdom of God, because it is there that we most closely share in God's own playing. Thank you. I'll see you again, or at least I'll see some of you again in a couple of weeks. What we're going to do in a couple of weeks, we're going to take kind of where I ended and move on and apply this in the realm of food. I really, really love food. I hope you do too. And we'll see how this idea of play and non-technocratic thinking might work out practically in the realm of eating and agriculture. I hope you join me. Thank you again so much. This has been such a tremendous honor. It was a great pleasure. Thank you.